Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. My name is Eric, I'm a SuiteScript coach over at Stoic Software, and today I'm joined in my hosting duties by Scott Dixon, one of Salto's customers. Scott, how are you?
Hi, Eric. Hi, everyone.
And the reason you're all here is for a demonstration of the Salto platform, specifically its ability to move sort of big, complicated customization objects from one NetSuite account to another safely, correctly, and quickly. So in our NetSuite accounts, it's pretty common to have a lot of customizations that need to move between environments. So from Sandbox to production, Sandbox to Sandbox, or your demo account to your customers. And it's pretty common for those custom objects to be pretty complicated, pretty large. So things like saved searches, custom forms have a ton of options. They have a lot of dependencies, have a lot of relationships to other customizations. And all of those things need to be validated and moved correctly before the target account will behave correctly. So today we want to look at how Salto facilitates all of that validation and movement in a way that makes it much simpler, more reliable, faster, and less risky. So before we get into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. The Q&A for this webinar is open. So if you have a question for Scott or myself while we're going, drop that right in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that. And we've scheduled a full hour for this, and some of that time is dedicated to Q&A. So at the end, reserve time to go through those questions, and I'll also work them in organically. Topical. This session is being recorded, and it will be distributed to you via email afterwards. I think that's it. So Scott, turn things over to you.
Awesome. So just a quick introduction. My name is Scott. I'm a customer engineer here at Salto. So I help our customers onboard and implement Salto into their change management process with NetSuite. So I'm going to be going through a demo of the platform today. And before we get started, just as a reminder, we've got an open poll about how you deploy changes. It is multiple choice, so please pick one or multiple of those ways. We're really curious to learn a little bit more about how you all are moving changes today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here and jump directly into the Salto platform. And here we go. All right, so I am in the Salto platform, and just to kind of set the stage here, I am going to be looking at two environments that I've got access to. I've got a sandbox and a production environment. Here I'm in my sandbox environment with NetSuite, and I've already fetched it with Salto. Now, a fetch in Salto is essentially pulling all of the configuration metadata. So that is information about, for example, all of the PDF templates, email templates, saved searches, transaction forms, and so on. And Salto will fetch all of that configuration metadata. These fetches can be ran on a schedule. They can also be ran at any time. You can also run what's called a quick fetch to only target the most recent changes that we see. For example, maybe you made an update to a workflow. Salto can see that in the audit logs and then only pull down that one specific change. Just a quick note here, Salto is pulling the configuration metadata through a kind of a combination of SDF, or Suite Cloud Development Framework. And so we've got access to all of the configuration metadata types that you may be used to using with SDF. As well as on top of that, Salto, we've built a Suite app that allows us to pull an additional set of metadata types. So in addition to all of the configuration metadata that can be managed with SDF, Salto is also pulling in information like settings or company features or data records like currencies or subsidiaries. So giving you a really full picture about what you have in your NetSuite environment. So once you run a fetch in Salto, the Explore tab is going to be populated in a file-like structure to show you what you've got set up. So for example, I'm here in the records folder, and each of these types here are the individual metadata types. And then if I open them up, let me actually go down to the workflows. These are each individual instance of a workflow that I've got set up in my sandbox environment. Now, once I pull one of these up, let me actually go into my create new op workflow right here. I can see how this workflow is set up. Now, probably the most interesting is going to be at the very bottom here, and this shows all of the dependencies. So in this case, I can see that this workflow depends on this safe search. I'm going to click through because I can actually pull up that safe search. I can see, and then I can scroll down to the bottom here, and I can see its dependencies. In this case, I can see that it depends on a transaction body custom field and a bundle type. Now, I can continue to drill into these dependencies. So for example, with this transaction body custom field, and again, at the bottom, I can see any of its dependencies or where it's being used. So in this case, I can see in this transaction body custom field, I can see that it's being referenced by a safe search, all of these transaction forms, in this case, a suite script, and then also workflow. So this is really helpful for that planning of impact or dependency analysis. Let's say that you wanted to remove or make an update to this field. I can immediately use Salto to come here and see, kind of estimate the scope of a potential change like that. Eric, I was curious, how would you use such a feature, being able to see the dependencies or where like a field is being used in your day-to-day?
Yeah, I think this level of visibility, for one, is incredibly helpful. Really have another way to do that, other than very manually. If you're using SDF, I don't think you're using like copy to account or bundles. There's not really a way to do this assessment at all, other than manually clicking through all of these things. So yeah, if we're going to maybe change a save search, and we know a script depends on it, for instance, or if we're cleaning up customizations, doing some optimization maybe, and thinking, can we delete this custom field, or can we change the permissions on this custom field? You can come in here and see everything that's using it. Especially being able to see all the scripts that use it. For me, that's incredible. It can be pretty tough to like find all the references that scripts have. So this visibility is amazing. I think helps you plan and organize and do that sort of impact assessment ahead of time, rather than afterwards deploying a change or deleting a field and figuring out, whoops, we had a workflow that needed that field, or had these two scripts that depended on it. So I think that's in the planning of changes. This is a huge.
Awesome. So additionally, because Salto is able to fetch all the configuration metadata, there's a couple of other operations you can run on that as well. So one example is if I come up to the roles that I've got up here, let's say you've got two or more than two very similarly named roles in your Sandbox environment, your production environment. You're trying to understand what is the difference between the two of them. So for example, down here, I've got a very helpfully named role called SRD Customer Center role. But then if I take a look, I've also got another very similarly named Customer Center role up here. So this is, would be a great one to take a look at. Maybe I could remove that potentially redundant role. With Salto, you can compare roles within the same environment with each other. So I'm going to click the compare button, and I can see instantly what are the actual differences between these two roles. So in this case, it looks like the only difference here is simply the name of it. If I scroll down to the bottom here, where I look at all the permissions, there's no actual difference with the permissions in these roles. So this might be a role that I could remove. It could help me clean up some of that tech debt. Meanwhile, if I take a look at this role, I've got a developer role here. And if I want to compare it with another developer role that I've got here called Developer Salto, if I click the compare, now when I can do or run the compare between the two of them, it's going to show me the individual permissions that actually have a difference in between those two roles, allowing me to, again, kind of understand before I were to make a change, what would the impact of removing one of those roles or keeping one of those roles in the environment be. So now that we've got all of our configuration metadata into Salto, I'm just looking at it in the context of one environment. But I also want to compare it against what I've got in my production environment. So we can do that in Salto by coming to the compare and deploy up here and beginning the comparison process. So I'm going to click on compare and deploy, and I'm going to select my Sandbox as the source, and my target is going to be my production environment. Now, I'm going to also use this as an opportunity to demonstrate how to move a form across. So I'm going to call this add new form. And I'm going to create a new comparison. Now, instantly, Salto is going to show you all of the differences between those two environments. So in this case, it's going to show me, essentially, it's showing me in the direction. If I want to make my production environment mirror my sandbox environment, this is the amount of changes that it would take. Now, I want to kind of break this down for you, because if I go to the Additions tab here, this shows essentially what would be lost if you were to do a sandbox refresh, because these are all additions. In other words, these are elements that only exist in sandbox right now. They don't exist at all in production. Modifications are those customizations that exist in both, but might have some sort of difference. And then another one I wanted to call out here was this deletions tab. This is essentially all of the elements that are in production, but that are not in sandbox. So you can kind of think of this as these are potentially items that have been added directly to production without any sort of testing or development within sandbox. So it might be interesting to take a look at what you got here. And Eric, I wanted to ask you about, when you're comparing those differences between Sandbox, have you ever run up against a case of accidentally deleting a configuration in Sandbox as part of the refresh process?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think work that gets deleted, changes that are going to be deleted or overwritten is one of the primary reasons people don't refresh their sandboxes. They're worried about losing all that work. Then their sandboxes start to drift longer. I had a client pretty recently who had a dev sandbox and a UAT sandbox, and that UAT sandbox, they were so afraid of sort of overriding the changes that they hadn't refreshed it for over a year. And what that means is your testing environment is completely separate from your production environment now. You're testing on two very unrelated environments in terms of the changes that are there, the settings, the data. You want to be testing on something that's close, almost identical to production, or as close as possible. So if you're letting your sandbox drift and drift and drift, huge problem. Worried about deleting stuff, you can come right in here with Salto and see exactly what will change, what you'll lose with a sandbox refresh. And even better, even if you do refresh, you can then restore that sandbox by deploying Salto.
Yeah. One other note is that in this compare and deploy flow, you'll notice that we're presenting all of the elements that have some sort of difference in this table view. Well, this table can also be exported as a CSV file. So in case you notice a huge list of items that you need to push to production ahead of that sandbox refresh, might be helpful to export that. You can use that to take a look with your larger team to see what's going to be your migration plan to make sure that you don't lose all this development that you've got in your Sandbox account. Now, so this is kind of around the comparison. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is earlier I had said about how Salto can also pull in things like company features and settings. One thing you can do actually with Salto is you can compare the company features in between environments. So here I'm looking at the company features and how they differ between those two environments that I have. Eric, I think you mentioned this might be helpful for if you're developing like a suite app.
Yeah, any kind of suite app or bundle or something you're distributing to clients where you don't have, you may not even have visibility into their account necessarily ahead of time. So being able to compare sort of the setup and not just compare, but also you can deploy these feature changes, right? So if you need to set up a sandbox, for instance, to mirror a client's account with their settings and their features just the way that client has them, you can do that quickly here. You can compare your sandbox. If as long as you have access to that account, you can pull this up and do that compare. It can also help with troubleshooting. A lot of times settings and features in the account dictate what or how certain scripts or functionality workflows and such behave. And it can be really tricky to debug if the reason something's not working is that a feature is. So this is a quick way to do that check of, okay, the environments match at the feature level. We can rule it out. Otherwise, ruling that out is really difficult.
Yeah, this is one of the first places I recommend for my customers to go when they're starting a migration project is, hey, let's just do a quick check, make sure that we've got the same features enabled on both environments. Even if you do that check in the UI, sometimes it does help to have this view in Salto where side by side you can do that direct comparison. Now, just as a reminder, we do have a poll open. Curious about how you all are deploying changes right now with NetSuite. So if you haven't answered already, we'd love to hear, because we'd like to review those results with you a little bit later on. So now I'd like to show how you would actually deploy a change using Salto. So in this case, I've got a transaction form that I've been developing in my Sandbox environment, and I'm ready to go ahead and move that to my production environment. So this would, of course, come under the Additions tab. Now, there's a number of different ways you can sort and filter with Salto. If you can see, I can add a filter. I can go to specific types and then go on down to a form. In this case, this transaction form. And this essentially shows me all of the transaction forms that don't exist in production yet. So the one that I want to deploy here is going to be called this custom purchase order form. And I can go ahead and add that to my list of items to deploy. Now, as I add this element to my deployment, you'll notice that it starts to flag any required dependencies. So Salto is running a dependency check every time you add new elements to be deployed to make sure that any of those dependencies that are being referenced by that element also exists in the target environment. So in this case, it depends on, it looks like 2 transaction body custom fields and 7 roles. So I want to go ahead and add these transaction body custom fields because I know that this form needs those to be able to work. However, I notice here I've got a number of roles that actually in development I'm just using for testing in my Sandbox environment. I don't actually want to move those over to production. So actually, I'm going to skip that, and I'll show you how to do that, how to move a transaction form without having to move those dependencies on those demo roles that I've got in my Sandbox environment. So I'm going to ignore those for now, but you'll notice that these also show up under the missing dependencies tab. So as you're doing deployments with Salto, it is always going to be constantly checking for those dependencies and making sure that you get those dependencies ahead of actually deploying those changes.
Real quick, Scott, can you jump back to the form definition there? So I just want to call this out for those of you who are using SDF and maybe only SDF. Look how fast that validation was of those dependencies. If you were doing this in SDF, you'd have to validate your project, and then it would tell you, hey, this body field is missing. And then you'd have to validate again. You have to add the field in, validate again. And that can take really long time if you have a really big SDF project. Maybe the project is your whole, all of your customization account. So this saves you a ton of time just checking these boxes. Look how fast this validation is. It tells you, oh, you also need this field. That's really impressive to me.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward with the deployment process. So I'm going to go and click Preview Deployment. Now, one thing to note here is this is giving me a warning because I haven't selected those required dependencies on that role, but I'll show you in the next step how I can kind of work around that. So this is going to run some validation, both on the Salto side, just to make sure that we've got everything that we need in order to deploy. It also runs some additional server-side SDF validation to ensure that these are changes that ultimately NetSuite is going to accept. So I'm going to go ahead and click Continue anyway, and then it's going to run those that validation. Now, while that's running, I want to take a look at the poll and see what we've got here. So it looks like we had 23 total responses, and of that, we've got 15 using manual, 13 copy to account, 7 using SDF, and then 5 using bundles. So it looks like there's a couple of you that are using a multiple number of ways to deploy, but majority looks like you're using manually. All right, so now I've got the deployment at the validation stage. Now, this actually failed the validation. Again, I knew that was going to happen because I'm referring to those roles that don't yet exist in production. Now, let me go ahead and open up this particular transaction form. So Salto is going to tell you what is that validation error that we're running across. In this case, it's running across those issues with those custom roles. Now, something that might be familiar to those of you that are familiar with SDF is how SDF can show you, what is the textual representation of a customization. In SDF, they use XML. In Salto, we use what our own configuration language we call Knuckle, or not another configuration language. Now, I've switched the Knuckle view here, and here we can see exactly, what is the textual makeup of this form here. Now, because let me go ahead and search for custom role. Here I can see every single place where those custom roles are being referred to within Salto. Now I can go through and remove every single one. Now, just to save some time here on the demo, I've already done that, and so I'm going to copy and paste a Knuckle text that doesn't have the reference to those custom roles. Just give me about 1 second here, and I can find that and go ahead and do that.
I think if you're using SDF, this should be pretty familiar, like you said. But if you're not using SDF, you're using bundles or something like that, this sort of textual representation of your elements is probably foreign. But I think it's really cool. You can come in here and just read the text description of the element and all of its settings and properties, and also change it. You can edit it directly from here, so no need to log into NetSuite, click through all the prompts and fields and forms and stuff, subtabs and all that. You just see the whole form right here and edit it. See, which I think is.
Now I'm going to go ahead and kind of run that validation again, because now I need to run the validation on that new transaction form that no longer has the references to those roles.
And just a quick reminder, the Q&A is open. Any questions come up, please share them there. We'll keep an eye on that.
Now, while this is running, again, those of you that have been leveraging SDF, you might be familiar with Git or Source Control for your customizations. Just a quick note for anyone who's not familiar with Git, it's a source control system that allows you to essentially create versions of software over time. We're able to leverage that in Salto because we're creating a textual representation of your configuration. So over time, you can create versions of your configurations. Now, today I'm going to show you an example about how we're leveraging Git to also create an approval process. So what we're going to do is this deployment is essentially going to create a pull request, and that pull request will show you what is the textual representation of the changes that I'm proposing to make to my target environment. That's what this little pending icon is showing here. As soon as that validation ends, we'll have a pull request that will show the exact textual representation of those changes. Let me go ahead and jump to it. It might get updated in the way, but I wanted to show you what exactly this is going to look like. Now, I'm showing you an example of integration with GitHub. So Git has a lot of different Git providers, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. Salto supports all of them. I'm just showing you an example in GitHub. But if I go to the files changed here, and again, this might be updated because I'm in the middle of running this validation. But essentially this will show you what are all the underlying changes being made to the customizations. So in this case, because I'm adding a transaction form and I'm adding those 2 custom fields, it's showing these 3 new files being added. Now, this is the great thing because you can actually see the level of detail. Not only am I saying, okay, Scott's about to add this transaction form, he's also adding these 2 fields, but I can see exactly what type of form, what type of fields are being added. Now, if I go back to the conversation here, actually, it's still running. What I've done here in GitHub, and again, you can set this up with any Git provider that you use, is I've set up an approval process where I need an approval to be able to merge this branch and ultimately move forward with that deployment in Salto. Let me actually show you an example of a past pull request. So this is one that Eric and I were working on yesterday. Very, very similar use case, actually. And here I can see his review where he went in and he was able to take a look at the changes that I proposed. He made a little comment and then ended up approving these changes, which then kicked off the deployment process automatically. So this would be very, very helpful in case you want to have a long-standing, not only change log of all those changes that are happening within your environment, but you've also got a record of any comments related to that that change, as well as who ultimately approved that change to go through.
So if you have the need for real sophisticated approvals and or like to go through, get another pair of eyes on your changes, this is a great way to do that. Developers will probably be pretty familiar with this process, but if you're not a developer, you might not be. This is a great way to have conversations about your changes and keep a record of those conversations and those changes over time. And again, who approved them, when they approved it, when it was merged, when it was deployed. You get all of that documentation in it.
I'm curious. Is anyone currently leveraging like some sort of approval process for those changes that get made to prod? If you are, just love to hear in the chat like a yes or I am using approvals.
Or if you're recoiling approval.
Now, while I wait for this the validation to complete here, essentially the next steps here would be to approve this deployment, and then that deployment then kicks off automatically. Now, if I come back to the compare and deploy in Salto, here I'm going to be able to see a history of all the deployments that have been happening to this environment. One second here, gotta log back in. Aha, here we go. So now I've got my deployment kind of ready to go. It's pushed all of those new changes to the validation, and all I need is someone to approve these changes. Eric, would you mind going in and reviewing and approving these changes for me so it can go ahead and deploy this to production?
Can you drop that link in chat? That'll be the...
Yes. Just one second here.
Actually, see it. I got a notification. All right.
Perfect. Now, while Eric approves that, I do want to show that Salto is honoring whatever sort of rules that you've got set up in your connected Git repo. So if you can have more sophisticated approvals, you can have even sophisticated custom checks or custom jobs that are running. And until they succeed, Salto is going to block that deployment. So here I can see, if you can see up here under deploy and push, I actually can't, well, now I can click that button because it looks like Eric has just approved those changes. Yeah. But before I wasn't able to click through. So this is just a great way to introduce that approval process. Now I'm going to go ahead and let this deployment run. But while it's running, I wanted to come back to the deployment history page and show you kind of the information that you'll be able to see after the deployments have run in Salto. So at the very bottom here, I can see all the history of the deployments that have been running. Now, at any time, I can go and click into that particular deployment. I can see exactly what was changed. And now what can also be really helpful if you do any sort of modification through Salto, if I click on the specific change, I can see a side-by-side, what were the specific changes that were made? In this case, we added a couple, we added the workflow, an additional workflow action. We added an additional state to this workflow. I can see exactly who did it. Also, because this was part of a pull request, I can view this pull request on GitHub, and I can see who exactly approved this change if there were any comments here. So again, a really helpful change log, as well as giving you more specific information about who did that change and who approved that change. Something to also to note is that if you have multiple Sandbox environments that you're leveraging for like a development and an integration or UAT environment, you can also promote those changes up using Salto as well. So I've just got 2 environments here in a Sandbox and production environment, but pretending that I had a third environment that I could leverage, I could select any of my below deployments, click on promote, and then promote those changes to my next higher up environment. It's going to take the same scope of those previous deployments and then move those up. Now, the great thing is Salto is going to run the validation again. So it, if we have any, for whatever reason, maybe in your higher environment, it's missing a field, Salto will run that validation and ensure that we've got everything required to push all those changes up to the into production.
I think that's really useful when if you've got, especially for larger projects, if you have developers writing code, you have admins making workflows or form customizations, searches, or whatever it might be. You've got sort of combined processes, but they're deploying separately, right? You can test the code without maybe needing the transaction form ready. So you're pushing all these individual changes up to your UAT environment, testing them all. Once they're all ready for production, come in here, check a few boxes, and push them all into production at the same.
Yeah, just speeding up the deployment process quite a bit by already having everything pre-selected. Now, one thing to note is while this deployment runs is that Salto is bidirectional. So let's say that you did have a hotfix that was made in production, you had an admin that made a change in production, you wanted to move that back to your Sandbox environment to keep it aligned without having to do a hard refresh of that entire Sandbox. If I click on compare and deploy here, just to show you what I'm talking about, is just as I picked my source environment being my Sandbox environment and my target environment being production, I can also flip that direction. So pushing from production to Sandbox. So that way you're constantly keeping your Sandbox aligned and not running into those problems where your Sandbox is so far misaligned from production that you can't actually develop or test it in Sandbox anymore. It looks like we get a question. Oh, Eric, can you increase your audio volume?
Yep. Hopefully this is better.
All right. So after the deployment, it is then going to push up those changes to our connected Git repo, and that Git repo is going to serve as a kind of like a change log of all the changes that have been occurring in that environment. So you're going to have a branch in your Git repo that will represent production or Sandbox, whatever environment that you're pushing up to, and you'll always be able to go back to that connected Git repo to see history of your changes. I did want to mention here, if I go to the audit tab using Salto, is that what happens for those changes that are happening out of band. So you've got, I had mentioned like that hotfix, or you've got an admin or developer that made a change directly in production, or using a different method to deploy. Salto can still catch those changes and still allow you to document those changes. Let me actually go to another environment, go back to my Sandbox environment because it's a little bit more noisy in there, and go to the audit tab here. But essentially what Salto does is every single time that a fetch is ran, Salto is going to cross-reference all the changes that we see in those scheduled or manual fetches. And we're going to see, have those changes been pushed up to Git? If not, they're going to be flagged as an unpushed file. Now, what an unpushed file means is that, remember how we were talking about those knuckle files, that's a textual representation of the customizations? Those are the files that we're talking about. So essentially a file has been modified, added, removed, but that change has not been pushed up to Git. So when you click preview push here, you're able to see all of the changes that have been happening that have not gone through a Salto deployment. So you can either, go through and take a look at each individual change. So it's going to show you a side by side what was modified here. You can also filter to specific users that made that change, as well as when a particular change was made. So that way, if I come through and I recognize, okay, I see someone updated the script, I recognize that user, I can go ahead and say, actually, this is related to, Scott's request. I can push up those changes, and I still have all of those changes documented in my Git repo, regardless if it's coming through a deployment or not. And then on top of that, I can also set up a monitor to send me a notification for those out-of-band changes. So I actually have one that came through recently, because I've got a monitor that's set up that anytime a new transaction body custom field is added, it's going to send me out an email. You can also configure these alerts to get sent out to Slack. And it's going to send you, in this case, because that monitor is saying simply, anytime a new transaction body custom field is added, send me an email. It's going to list out, using the script ID of those fields, what was added, and then a detailed change report in a PDF format showing you exactly what was added, modified, or removed. Eric, I wanted to ask, are there any cases where you would have wanted to be notified that someone made a change either in production or Sandbox that kind of took a while to actually track down?
Sure. I think first we sort of already talked about it, and you already have this monitor set up if you jump back there real quick. But when features or settings change, I kind of want to know about that. Those shouldn't change too often, but when they do, it's usually a pretty significant change. So I would love to know about that. More specifically, with scripting, I think what happens, one common technique, I guess, is to leverage save searches in your scripts, but there's no way to prevent save searches completely from being modified or adjusted, edited. Any administrator can always edit any save search, and they don't always know that a script depends on it. So I would love to know anytime a save search changes that is referenced by a script. I would love to know that, just so I can check and make sure, like, we didn't remove a column that the script relies on, or we didn't change some calculation in the search that will affect the math in the script or the report that we're generating or something like that. So, and I know that's a use case I have built in Salto, is that monitor that will tell me if any save search that is referenced by any script is modified. I can get alerted in email or in Slack right away and just go check, like, is that an innocuous change for the script, or do I need to go adjust the script now? So I think that's incredibly useful. It helps you be so much more proactive, I guess, in these changes, especially if you are monitoring your Sandbox before these changes get to production. Obviously, also monitor your production too, but I think this sort of thing, this alerting, helps you be so much more both proactive and faster to react to potential problems.
Yeah, I think that really rings true for a lot of the customers that I work with, Eric. Using a combination of setting up notifications, as well as keeping up to tabs on all the changes through pushing up your changes to Git, you're able to get a handle on all the changes that are occurring in the environment.
A question from David here. Can notifications be filtered for object script IDs like a regular expression for scripted searches?
Yes, they can.
Yes.
And actually that, David, that's exactly how you would do it, is you can use a regex max for script searches.
Yep. That is exactly the case that I set up in my own Salto account. I looked for all the save searches with a certain prefix in their ID and get alerted based on that. And it's fantastic. I know it's a really common use case for, especially for partners, but also for some, end user teams, to put some sort of identifier or prefix in all the custom IDs that they use, so they know we made this. This is ours. We own this. And so you can search on those custom IDs for that specific pattern or identifier, whatever it might be. We didn't show that, but it might be useful to do that in the Explore tab. Just your whole configuration is searchable, and it's searchable with patterns, with strings, of course, and
yeah,
it's great.
So for example, these are my initials, and I tend to prefix all of the customizations that I put in our NetSuite environments with SRD, so I can at a quick glance see exactly what elements have that in their title. Now, what's also interesting is if I click on over to the content tab, is because we're pulling up the NOCL files, so again, the textual representation of those customizations, you can search through the content of these files themselves. This can be really helpful in case you not only are you searching using whatever term that you want, but let's say that you remember, you wrote a function in a Suite script, but you can't remember for the life of you what that Suite script is called. You can go ahead and just search through the content tab. It's pretty much, you can think of it as running a Control F across all of your customizations in NetSuite. So I wanted to check if anyone had any questions. Feel free to pop them in the Q&A or even in the chat if you'd like. If you have any particular use cases that you're trying to solve, or any deployment pains that you run into that you wanted to ask us about, we'd love to hear about them. We will be sending out, after the presentation, we will send out you all a link to the recording, as well as some other resources about how to learn more about Salto, if you are interested.
I can talk about a little pain point in the meantime. For
Yes,
those of you
please.
using SDF, you may have the same pain, but recently I was working on a team with for a large public company that had a lot of need for controls, approvals, documentation of any changes we make to production. And we were using SDF to do all of our deployments and validation, but it got to be such a pain to manage, especially save searches and transaction forms, because the validation and the deployments of those items in particular in SDF just were not sufficient for our needs. The validation just didn't catch enough problems before deployment. We had to take them out. We just ended up taking out save searches and forms completely from our SDF repo, which means we no longer had any tracking on those. We couldn't deploy them automatically. Everything was managed manually, and it was a nightmare. And all of that because Salto, if we had been using Salto, we'd have this sort of higher level representation and these additional checks and validations and deployment capabilities. All of that would have gone away. I do see a question from Rohit.
Mm-hmm.
How does Salto handle circular dependencies, where a search is using a record and that record is using the search?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is it does. The little bit longer of an answer is during the deployment process, you notice how it runs that deployment preview that is essentially, it's got two steps. One is it's kind of queuing up all of the changes ready to actually push into the target environment, and running some kind of Salto side checks, just making sure that we've got everything that we need to be able to push that change to the target environment. The second part is also running that SDF validation, just to make sure, again, those changes are changes that we can make. Part of that is making sure that we've got the right order in the SDF project when you push that through, and so that's something that will be handled for you essentially automatically with Salto as part of the deployment process.
That's a good question. Thank you.
So I've reached the end of what I wanted to show you here today with Salto. So just to kind of do a quick recap, using Salto to pull down all the configuration metadata that makes up your NetSuite environment, being able to explore the dependencies where different fields are being used. You can compare, for example, the similar roles in the same environment to understand potential tech debt in your NetSuite environment. Using Salto to compare changes between environments, deploying changes between environments as well, setting up an approval process to kind of gatekeep those deployments, as well as using Salto to document and monitor the entire change management process. So you have a really good understanding of the changes that are made from a proactive stance, because you'll get notifications when they get sent out, but also reactive stance because you'll know exactly what to do when those changes occur. So we got a couple of questions here. So first one, could you show how you set up the notification for changes to searches used by scripts? So under the monitors tab here, actually, I've got this already set up. So under the this one up here, so essentially I am taking a look at all of my, in this case, I'm looking at all of my saved searches. Now, what I'd want to do here, if I wanted to update this to the ones that are being used by scripts, is I can also switch to a query-based selection, which is using a regex, and I can use that to specify specific searches. Eric, you mentioned that you'd set this up for also the ones that are being used by scripts. Did you have a specific way of how you set that one up?
Yeah, you just go right down to filter by reference. And so what this will do is search through the dependencies of these saved searches. And so now from here, you can basically say any file, if any file, and you could even say if any JS file is referencing this saved search, so you can use, instead of, you could switch to your query mode instead of selection mode. And then you filter by reference and you say, if any JS file is using this search, it will trigger the notification. And I actually have a video on YouTube, on Salto's YouTube channel, about this exact use case for the filter by reference feature.
Oh, cool.
I don't know if we can maybe get a link to that in chat, but you check out Salto's YouTube channel. It should be up there.
Thank you for the great question.
Yeah.
And then we also had a question from Jeffrey. Is the word Salto an acronym? What does it stand for? That's a great question. It's actually, I believe it's the Italian word for jump. We've also used it as an inspiration for other aspects of Salto. So the NACL files is obviously, it's spelled NaCl, or the chemical element for salt. Yeah, so Rohit, looks like you picked it up too, the puns with the salt and the NACL file. Also, it's worth noting our mascot here. His name is Knuckles, or short for Knuckle.
Right. Let's see.
And we do have the rest of the hour, so if there are any more questions, but if not, we'd love to chat, and we are going to be providing a recording of this, and we'll probably, I think we should probably follow up with the link to our YouTube channel as well. It's got a lot of really helpful tutorials, as well as the one that Eric mentioned, where you can set up the monitor on the saved searches that are referenced by SuiteScript files.
Yep. And if you are, there's a link to the YouTube channel in the chat. And oh, thank you, Jeff. There's one in the Q&A as well. And if you are interested in learning more about Salto, there is a link to salto.io. You can request a free demo, and you can also set up a free trial there to check things out for yourself. And I think if there is no other questions, we'll wrap up.
But thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate your participation in the polls and great questions.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And thank you everyone for joining us.